Our story begins on a beautiful afternoon in Durban, South Africa. Or not. Our story begins... Our story just began. Hooray. Our story begins on a beautiful morning in Durban, South Africa. My wife and I had just gone for a swim in the Indian Ocean. I'd had a wonderful breakfast and ordered my second cappuccino. Then I reached for the local newspaper. It was the morning after the municipal elections. And I saw this photo. My heart sank. To a dermatologist like myself, this picture can mean only one thing: a lethal form of malignant melanoma. Don't take my word for it. Here's a photo from a dermatology textbook. What to do? I went home, rushed to the telephone, and called the photo editor of the newspaper. I said to her, I hate to bother you. I know this is really strange. I'm a professor of dermatology in the United States at Duke University. I've written textbooks and articles, and I'm most worried about the man in this photo. I said, this is a kind of melanoma that's most common in skin of color. And to emphasize my point, I told her this is exactly the kind of melanoma that was lethal to Bob Marley. She listened carefully to what I said and promised to call me back as soon as they found the man in the photo and brought him to medical attention. I was relieved and satisfied to know she was doing this. 2 minutes later, the phone rang, and it was her. And she said the following. She said, Professor Prose, yes, is there any chance the man in the picture simply has the mark that each of us gets when we go to vote in South Africa to prevent us from voting a second time? At that moment, my mother-in-law entered the living room. I had learned a lesson in cultural humility. I also learned that it's a very thin line between being a humanitarian, a brilliant physician, and a complete nitwit. In the next 10 minutes, you'll have an opportunity to draw your own conclusions. When I teach seminars to doctors or residents, medical students, I always begin with the same metaphor. I say, imagine what it would take to be on opposite sides of the table from the patient with the problem in the middle. And then I say, what would it take to get onto the same side of the table looking at the problem together? A wonderful friend of mine in South Africa, Joseph Buthelezi, who is steeped in Zulu culture, once told me that when he goes to see the doctor he most likes, the doctor who seems to really care about him, he feels that he and his doctor are singing the same song. Of course, now you know we're going to talk about Leo Tolstoy, and about this very particular novel, which is The Death of Ivan Ilyich. So in The Death of Ivan Ilyich, Tolstoy documents the remarkable story of a man who is dying of a serious illness, alone, frustrated, and worried. And in this late 19th century novel, he describes a conversation between the doctor and Ivan, and it goes like this. Everything took place as Ivan had expected, and as it always does. There was the usual waiting and the important air assumed by the doctor with which he was so familiar. To Ivan Ilyich, only one question was important. Was this case serious or not? But the doctor ignored that inappropriate question. From his point of view, it was not the one under consideration. The real question was to decide between a floating kidney, chronic catarrh, or appendicitis. From the doctor's summing up, Ivan Ilyich knew that things were bad, but that for the doctor and for everybody else, it was a matter of indifference. We sick people probably often ask inappropriate questions, said Ivan, but tell me in general, is this complaint dangerous or not? The doctor looked at him sternly over his spectacles with one eye. I have already told you what I consider necessary and proper. The analysis may show something more. And the doctor bowed. What is important then in the doctor-patient conversation in the 21st century? To me, the thing that's more important than all our other considerations and skills and ability is cultivating curiosity. My favorite article in all the medical literature over many years is this one, written by Faith Fitzgerald, a physician in San Francisco, about the role of curiosity in medicine. And in the story, in the article, she tells the following story. She reached a point where she felt that interns and residents in her hospital had absolutely no interest in the stories of the patients and their families. She said to the residents, look, she said, take me to the bedside of your least interesting patient, and I'll prove to you one way or the other that that person is interesting. The residents took Faith to the bedside of a little old lady who had very little to say, answered every question with one or two words, and Faith was starting to worry she had finally met the uninteresting patient. In desperation, Faith asked this woman, have you ever been in the hospital before? And the woman said, yes. And then Faith asked, oh, she said, what for? And the woman said, I broke my arm. Faith said, well, how did you break your arm? And the woman said, well, a steamer trunk fell on it. And Faith said, well, why did the trunk fall? And the woman said, well, the ship lurched. And then Faith said, well, why did the ship lurch? And the woman said, well, because it hit the iceberg. This is a true story. And Faith pointed out that after this revelation, this woman became interesting to all of the newspapers and TV stations in San Francisco, and eventually to the interns and residents. And I often think that if Faith had spent a few more minutes asking more questions, she might have found out what this woman was doing before the ship hit the iceberg. In the conclusion of her article, Faith beautifully states, I believe that it is curiosity that converts strangers into people we can empathize with. I believe it is curiosity that converts strangers into people we can empathize with. So the skills that I teach to young doctors are really valuable when working with a patient with concerns and worries. But think, as you hear these skills and ideas, think about your own life. Imagine giving advice to a close friend who's trying to deal with a really annoying boyfriend. And which of these skills and techniques might come in handy? And I'll point out a few as we go along. First of all, I encourage every doctor to put his or her hand on the doorknob before entering the room and take a deep breath with the conscious decision to pay attention. And then ask an open-ended question, not a yes or no question. Ask, for example, what worries you most about your illness? Or how have you been since the last visit? And then listen, because the average doctor interrupts in the first 17 seconds of the medical interview. Now, the open-ended question is not the same all over the world. I was in Botswana and learned from a wonderful pediatrician that when he sees an infant, his first question to the mom is, how is the soft spot, the spot on the center of the head? Why? Because this is the spot that is focused upon by the traditional healer. And only by asking the mom in this unthreatening sort of way can he be sure of the fact that the mother has actually taken this child to see a healer. In the Zulu language, there is no single word for depression. So if you're going to ask a patient, how are you feeling today? You might have to imagine responses like umoya upansi, or sangala, or ishiloya ubushlungu, as ways of expressing what we call, in our culture, depression. Then I strongly suggest to reflect back what you've heard, which is simply to say to the patient, so what you're saying is, or let me make sure if I have this right. And this is a way of my making sure I was listening, but more so a way of saying to the patient that I've heard what they had to say. Would it be okay if, asking permission before giving advice, would it be okay if I interrupt you to ask some specific questions? Would it be okay if I explain what I think went wrong? Would it be okay if I give you some advice about this health issue? Or, on the other side, would it be okay if I give you some advice about how to get rid of your useless boyfriend? The same technique. There's only one time I recommend not to use this technique of asking permission before giving advice. It's with your own teenage children. These are the people who don't want to hear your advice. You're going to give it anyway. Don't damage your credibility. A few other key phrases. I wish we had better treatments. Instead of saying I'm sorry, I think to say I wish. And let's decide together what to do next. And finally, at the end, what other questions do you have? Not do you have questions, but what questions do you have? And being careful not to say this with your hand on the doorknob on the way out. Okay, now we're going to go back to Tolstoy in a different sort of a way. In the fall, I teach a freshman focus course, and we spend an entire semester talking about empathy, curiosity, and cultural humility. The empathy and curiosity of my students inspires me in many ways. Toward the end of the semester, each student is asked to write an additional short chapter to add to Tolstoy's book. What would happen if the empathic doctor arrived at Ivan's bedside? Many of the student chapters are remarkable, and I will read from just one by Gabby Zeggers. The doctor removed his coat and sat beside Ivan Ilyich, resting his hand on his shoulder. Hello, my name is Dr. Viktor Viktorovich, and I will do whatever I can to clarify for you what is wrong and how we can fight this. The doctor's expression was more soothing to Ivan than any drug could ever be. Then his expression moved from one of curiosity to one of compassion. And after a caring and compassionate discussion, carefully explaining Ivan's symptoms and the gravity of his diagnosis, Dr. Viktorovich concluded, please call upon me again if you have any questions or concerns, or you simply need someone to talk to. If I were in your place, I would try to focus on the instances in your life which you feel best about. The doctor said to his dying patient, your life is not over yet. Thank you.